more Jedi survived Order 66 than the Empire ever expected, and the count kept climbing. The myth after the Purge was simple. Obi-Wan and Yoda were the only ones left, and for years, the galaxy believed it. 19 years later, Luke Skywalker found Obi-Wan hiding on Tatooine, and years after that, he found Yoda on Dagobah, still teaching, still carrying the knowledge the Empire had tried to destroy. 2 decades of hunting, and still, in places no one thought to look, the Force refused to die. The real question was never just how many Jedi walked away from that day, it was why, after 20 years of hunting, the Empire kept finding more of them. The Jedi Order, at the height of the Clone Wars, was spread across a galaxy of countless worlds and millions of systems. The Jedi served as generals on dozens of active fronts, as diplomats and investigators on hundreds of worlds that never saw direct combat. They staffed a temple on Coruscant that served as a school, library, and seat of power all at once. Roughly 10,000 members strong at the start of the conflict, the Order was a small fraction of the galaxy's population, but a staggering number of people to locate and eliminate at the same time. Ending them all required something that had never been built before, and Palpatine had spent decades preparing it. The Clone Wars had given him the cover he needed. Every deployment, every new clone unit shipped to the front lines was another piece of the mechanism falling into place. By the end of the conflict, nearly every active Jedi in the galaxy was standing within arm's reach for a soldier who carried the order to strike them down. The day the Jedi fell began with a single command. Palpatine triggered a failsafe hidden inside the Republic's clone army. Every soldier had been engineered with a small implant in their brain, and when the signal fired, it overrode everything else. The Jedi were traitors and had to be struck down immediately. The design was not just technical, it was personal. For 3 years, Jedi fought beside their clones. They know their troopers by name, by habit, by the way they moved under fire. Meals had been shared, the same ground had been bled on, and the same fallen had been mourned together. They were the closest thing many Jedi had to family during the conflict, and the chips turned that closeness into the thing that ended them. That was the weapon, and it fired the moment Palpatine gave the word. On Coruscant, the temple fell as the betrayals unfolded across the galaxy. Vader led clone forces through the temple doors, and what followed was not a fight, but a slaughter. The temple held the Order's archives, its training halls, and a population of younglings, Padawans, and support staff who had no battlefield to escape to. Vader moved through the building personally, striking down younglings in the halls where he had once trained as a boy. With the temple gutted, surviving Jedi lost more than a building. They lost the one location in the galaxy where any Jedi could arrive and find others, along with the archives, the training halls, and every way they had to coordinate. Without it, every surviving Jedi had become isolated, cut off from anyone who might have helped them understand what had just happened. Across the galaxy, the betrayals landed at the same time. Some Jedi were on ships, some in council chambers, some meditating in the field, some teaching younglings who would never finish their training. The signal made no distinction between a general leading a charge and a healer healing the wounded. Ki-Adi-Mundi halted, turned, and fell under fire from the forces he had been leading. Aayla Secura was shot down on Felucia, surrounded by soldiers she trusted, and Plo Koon's starfighter was blown apart by his own wingmen. The ambush had been built for one condition: a Jedi physically surrounded by armed clones in active combat. In those conditions, survival was nearly impossible, and the strikes were fast, coordinated, and devastating. The galaxy held millions of systems, though not every Jedi was standing next to a clone when the Order came. The simplest crack in the Purge was always distance. Order 66 depended on proximity. The weapon only worked when a Jedi was physically surrounded by clones who received the signal, and any Jedi outside that radius survived the first wave. Palpatine had designed a strike that could only kill at close range, and in a galaxy of trillions, close range was never going to reach everyone. Eno Cordova survived because his work placed him in exploration rather than combat, far from any clone unit. In Legends, General Ram Koda refused to use clone troopers entirely and built his own volunteer force. and the same gap protected Cal, Kanan, Ahsoka, and Kakruk, who survived for decades in hiding. Every Jedi the weapon could not reach was a flaw in the design the Empire would spend years trying to seal. The Force gave some Jedi the thinnest possible warning, a flicker of danger before the first shot was fired. Not enough to understand what was happening, not enough to form any kind of plan, but enough to move before the moment closed. On Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi was riding a creature along a cliff face when his own commander opened fire. He fell, survived the fall, and escaped into the planet's sinkhole tunnels. On Kashyyyk, Yoda sensed something wrong a heartbeat before his escort troopers raised their blasters. 2 clones fell before the rest could fire. Wookiee allies who were not under clone command helped him reach a ship. Neither Obi-Wan nor Yoda outfought Order 66 in any real sense. They survived a few seconds of danger through instinct, luck, and the ground they happened to be standing on, and both spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of everyone who had not been so fortunate. The adults who gave their lives for younglings carved the deepest cracks in the Purge. On Kaller, Depa Billaba sensed her clones turning and ordered her Padawan Caleb Doom to run. She died holding the line so he could. The boy who survived would spend years hiding under a false name, bearing his training, carrying the guilt of being alive when his master was not. Every sacrifice left behind someone who would carry the loss forward. Aboard the Albedo Brave, Jaro Tapal shielded his Padawan Cal Kestis during the ambush and gave his life getting him to safety. Cal later made it to Bracca, where he spent years on a junkyard planet, suppressing his connection to the Force, terrified that using it even once would bring the Empire down on him. He would carry the sound of his master's final moments for years, long after the world around him had moved on. In the Jedi Temple, Keller and Beck fought through the corridors to reach the youngling Grogu and fly him off Coruscant. In every case, the Jedi who fell created the seconds that the Jedi who lived needed. Survival was measured in heartbeats, purchased entirely by sacrifice. The younglings who escaped were too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives. They had not earned their survival through strength or skill. They had earned it because someone loved them enough to give everything, and that knowledge would shape everything they became. Even the clones were not a perfect instrument of the Purge. The inhibitor chips were effective on a massive scale, but they were biological implants inside biological brains, and biological systems do not always perform as designed. In the Clone Wars final season, Ahsoka Tano was trapped aboard a cruiser, surrounded by a full crew of clone troopers with no planet to escape to and no allies in sight. Ahsoka helped free Captain Rex from the chip, proving that the programming was powerful, but not absolute. The cruiser still went down, claiming the clone crew, while Ahsoka, Rex, and Maul escaped the larger disaster. Ahsoka did not escape Order 66 cleanly. The cost was enormous, and she had buried the clone troopers she had once commanded in rows of makeshift graves on a barren moon, marking each one with a helmet, the last thing she could give to soldiers who had been her friends before the chips took them away. The vast majority of the Jedi Order fell on that day, but not every clone followed the command. Clone Force 99, a squad of genetically altered troops introduced in the Bad Batch, resisted the programming and went rogue, choosing desertion over obedience. The galaxy was too large and too unpredictable for a single coordinated strike to reach every Jedi at once, and a wave that claims nearly all of its targets across a civilization of trillions still leaves survivors. Surviving the Purge was only the beginning of what came next. Order 66 ended Jedi lives in a single afternoon, but the Empire spent the next 2 decades finishing the job one survivor at a time. Living through the strike did not mean living through what followed. The survivors who lived past the first day entered a galaxy that was actively pursuing them, and the damage was not only physical, it reached into the mind, the spirit, and in some cases, the soul. The Empire built the Inquisitorious soon after, filling it with captured, corrupted, and broken Force users, and sending them to track down the survivors the initial wave had missed. Not every Jedi who lived through Order 66 stayed recognizable as a Jedi. Survival did not always look like victory. Some carried the memory and teachings forward, keeping the knowledge alive and hiding. Others were shielded by the compassion of strangers who risked everything to protect them. Others shattered under the weight of isolation and guilt. And still, others were captured and turned into the very instruments sent to pursue their own kind. Ahsoka Tano survived as a witness, someone who kept the Jedi's teachings alive without the institution that had once held them. She had left the Jedi Order before it fell, walking away from the Council after being falsely accused of a crime she did not commit. Leaving the Order changed the circumstances of her survival, but it did not remove her from Order 66's reach. Eventually, she took the name Fulcrum and became an intelligence contact for the growing rebellion, running networks of informants and coordinating operations across the Resistance. Operating between cells, feeding information to people who had never met her, Ahsoka built the skeleton of a movement that would one day challenge Imperial power directly. She carried the Order's teachings while keeping a clear distance from its failures, and when she finally faced Vader in the ruins of a Sith temple on Malachor, she drew a line between herself and the institution she had once walked away from. She was not the only one keeping the memory alive. Obi-Wan spent 19 years in the deserts of Tatooine, guarding Luke Skywalker from a distance, using the Force for almost nothing, aging in silence. He lived under a false name, kept to himself, and became just another old man in a place the Empire barely noticed. 19 years of suppressing who he was, watching a boy grow up from a distance, carrying every failure and every loss from the Clone Wars in a place where no one would ever ask about them. The deserts were his burden and his post. His survival was not about Obi-Wan. It was about keeping one boy alive long enough for the galaxy to have a second chance. Kanan Jarrus, the Padawan who had once been Caleb Doom, went underground for years, hiding who he was, carrying a blaster and a lightsaber built to conceal his past. He became invisible by doing nothing more remarkable than being ordinary, and the Empire had no way to tell the difference. Eventually, he found a Force-sensitive orphan named Ezra Bridger on Lothal and trained him with lessons he had never finished learning himself, making it up as he went, doubting every step. Kanan proved something that mattered deeply. Jedi knowledge did not need the Temple, the Council, or any formal system to survive. It only needed someone willing to pass it on, even badly. Grogu's survival tells a different story, one shaped entirely by ordinary people. He had been a youngling in the Temple when the strike began, and Kelleran Beck had given everything to get him out. Years later, Din Djarin, a Mandalorian bounty hunter with no connection to the Force and no reason to care about Jedi, chose to protect the youngling instead of delivering him to an Imperial client. That decision was not a Jedi act, it was a deeply human one, and it pointed to the biggest flaw in the Imperial strategy. Finding Jedi required that nobody in the civilian population be willing to help them hide, and that level of obedience does not exist in any population, anywhere, under any government. Plenty of people were willing, and some of them organized. The hidden path, shown in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, turned compassion into a working system. Safe houses, false identities, pilots, routes, and people willing to lie to Imperial forces to protect fugitives they wanted gone. Quinlan Vos, a Jedi Master who had spent the Clone Wars running undercover operations and walking the line between light and dark, appeared on a hidden path contact list, proof that he had survived Order 66 and found shelter within the network. Nari, a fugitive Jedi from the same series, proves that survivors were still surfacing years later, and the hidden path proves that some civilians organized it to help them disappear. Farmers closed doors behind strangers, pilots changed course to avoid Imperial checkpoints, and entire families risked execution to shelter a fugitive Jedi for a single night, asking nothing in return except that the stranger keep moving and stay alive. The network ran on trust, with each member knowing only the contacts immediately above and below them in the chain. A single betrayal could unravel an entire route, and some did, but new members stepped in wherever gaps appeared. The network kept rebuilding itself faster than it could be torn apart. Not every survivor walked away whole, and some fell further than anyone imagined. Terran Malicos crash-landed on Dathomir after Order 66, and, cut off from any community that could anchor him, abandoned everything the Jedi had taught him, eventually dominating local Night Brother warriors and bending the Night Sister Mirren to serve as power. When Cal Kestis encounters him in Jedi Fallen Order, Malicos is unrecognizable as the man he once was. Boda Kuna in Jedi Survivor appeared to be a fellow fugitive, but had secretly worked with Imperial intelligence to protect his daughter, Kata, turning his love into leverage the Empire could use. His unmasking is devastating because it is so easy to understand. A father willing to betray anyone if it meant keeping his child alive. Baylan Skoll kept his skills but lost his faith, convinced that both sides were trapped in a cycle neither could break. In the Ahsoka series, he's searching for something older than either order on the distant world of Peridea, something he believes could end the conflict at its root. His exhaustion was not surrender, but the slow cost of surviving for years without anything left to believe in. Cere Junda spent years cut off from the Force entirely, consumed by guilt after being captured and subjected to Imperial interrogation. That guilt would later shape her for years before she found a way to rebuild. The Purge had not only scattered the Jedi, but fractured them from the inside, and even the fractured ones were names the Empire could not cross off its list. Even the pursuers the Empire sent to end the Jedi had once been Jedi themselves. Trilla Siduri, Cere's own Padawan, was captured after Order 66 and broken through the specific cruelty of her master's forced betrayal under interrogation. Imperial Command did not need Trilla to believe in the Sith. It needed her to stop believing in anything else. If her own master could give her up under pain, then every lesson about loyalty and the light was empty. Trilla became the second sister, an inquisitor who tracked other survivors with the precision of someone who knew exactly how they thought. She knew their instincts, their training, their patterns of movement, because they had once been hers. She was far from the only one. The Empire turned dozens of captured Jedi into hunters, each one living proof that Order 66 had left work unfinished. Rebels revealed that Luminara Unduli, captured and killed, was used even in death, her remains kept by Imperial forces as bait to lure other survivors out of hiding. The Grand Inquisitor, a former Jedi Temple guard who had once stood for duty and discipline, became the chief tracker when those same qualities were pointed the other way. He would eventually let himself fall rather than face whatever awaited him for failure. Fear is a leash that wears through over time, and the Inquisitorious was held together by nothing stronger. Reva had survived the Temple strike as a youngling by hiding among the dead. She carried that memory into adulthood and joined the Inquisitors not out of loyalty, but as a long plan to get close enough to Vader to end him, to avenge the youngling she had watched him cut down when she was barely old enough to hold a training saber. Her eventual choice to spare Luke Skywalker rather than continue the cycle was the moment something in her began to shift. Barriss Offee followed yet another path into the Inquisitorious, her imprisonment and broken faith twisted into service by Imperial command. The survivors now included the very people the Empire had sent to erase them. Vader spent 2 decades proving the Jedi were not gone. Every Inquisitor answered to him, and each survivor he faced carried the same trace of the life he had thrown away. When one of them showed a flicker of the person they had been, he struck them down, because that flicker was the thing he could not afford to see in himself. Ending them was easier than sitting with the memory of the man he had been before the suit, before the fire, before the younglings in the temple. Every kill was a burial of something in himself, and the deeper he buried it, the harder he hunted. His relentless pursuit was itself an admission. If the Jedi were truly gone, there would be no one left to chase, and the pursuit never ended because they kept appearing in places the Empire had already cleared. Cere Junda's final act proved what the Empire spent 2 decades trying to deny. After years of cutting herself off from the Force, Cere had already begun reconnecting during the events of Fallen Order. By the time of Jedi Survivor, she stood as a restored protector of the hidden path, and a builder of something Imperial Command feared. She had rebuilt not an army, not a fighting force, but a hidden collection of Jedi knowledge, records, teachings, and a gathering place where fugitives could find each other and believe the past had not been completely erased. She built it on the belief that even if she did not live to see the Jedi return, someone would find what she had saved and learn from it. When the Imperial forces found what she had built, Seer did not run. She stood in front of it and faced Vader himself, knowing what he was, knowing what he had done to Trilla, knowing he was stronger. She fell not because she was weak, but because what she protected mattered more than her survival, and she gave her life defending the hidden path, her found family, and the idea that Jedi knowledge still mattered. The Inquisitorial database was the Empire's quiet confession that Order 66 had not ended the Jedi problem. It tracked targets believed to have escaped the initial wave, and with every year that passed, the database grew rather than shrank. New names surfaced faster than old ones were crossed off, and some belonged to Jedi that Imperial Command had never known existed. Survivors thought to be dead turned up alive, and Jedi who had hidden so deeply that they were never listed in the first place began to appear. They did not build that database because the Jedi were gone. They built it because they were not. Every Inquisitor sent into the field, every judgment, every wanted notice served a double purpose. It ended a target, and it reminded the entire galaxy that someone out there was still worth pursuing. For civilians who remembered the Jedi as peacekeepers, the Empire's relentless pursuit was proof that the Jedi cause still lived, and that it still mattered enough for the ruling power to pour resources into ending it. The resources were enormous, spanning Inquisitors, probe droids, informant networks, and the personal attention of Vader himself. But the galaxy was more enormous still. Across the Outer Rim and beyond, former Jedi took new names, found quiet work, and tried to forget the abilities that made them targets. Some worked as farmers, others as mechanics, others as traders on worlds so far from the core that Imperial patrols rarely passed through. Gunji, a Wookiee youngling from the Temple, found shelter among his own people on Kashyyyk, far from the Empire's tightest grip. The Empire's pressure worked in one sense. These survivors shut themselves down willingly because using the Force meant being found, and being found meant the end. But a Jedi who has stopped using the Force is still a Jedi, and Imperial Command had no way of knowing where or when that moment of return might arrive. The pressure created silence, not extinction, but the breaking always came without warning. The Force is not something that can be turned off forever. It surfaces in unguarded moments, hums beneath every suppressed instinct, and eventually draws a Jedi back to the thing they were born to do. A survivor who had buried her lightsaber could feel it stirring again in a moment of danger, in a dream, in the cry of a child who needed help. The Empire could monitor ports and scan for anomalies, but it could not detect a quiet person on a quiet world who had simply decided to stop running. New Force-sensitive younglings were still being born across the galaxy, beyond Imperial reach. The Republic had found these younglings through testing and willing community cooperation. Parents had given their Force-sensitive sons and daughters to the Jedi Temple because they trusted the Order, because the Republic's social agreement made that feel safe and even honorable. The Empire could not rely on the same trust. Parents did not hand their younglings to a government they feared, and communities did not report Force-sensitive neighbors to a power they distrusted. Many families had reasons to hide their younglings rather than report them, and in the years after Order 66, that silence only deepened. Entire communities went quiet, and the Force-sensitive younglings growing up inside them had no idea what they were. Jocasta Nu, the Jedi Chief Librarian, survived Order 66 long enough to attempt something remarkable. The Darth Vader Dark Lord of the Sith comic run follows her effort to preserve a list of Force-sensitive younglings across the galaxy, along with what remained of the Temple's records. That list was not just a set of names, it was the future of the Force itself, every potential student the Order might never reach and the Empire might never find. She understood that the ruling power could strike down every living Jedi and still lose, as long as it could not claim the next generation. Vader ended her, but the principle she gave her life for outlived her. Knowledge survived in teaching devices called holocrons, in sacred texts, in ancient ruins and hidden archives. and in living teachers who passed it forward one student at a time. By the mid-Imperial years, the Jedi were no longer vanishing, but resurfacing. Cal Kestis had reconnected with the Force, and Kanan Jarrus had come out of hiding to actively train Ezra Bridger. Ahsoka Tano was operating as fulcrum for a rebellion growing bolder every month. Grogu would later prove that even Temple younglings had remained hidden for decades, protected by people who owed the Jedi nothing and helped anyway. Imperial forces had been pursuing survivors for years, and the list of names they had not yet reached was longer than it had been on the day the pursuit began. The archives Cere had built, the lessons Kanan was teaching, the text that Luke would one day carry forward, none of it needed the Temple to endure. On a planet no one had thought to look at closely, a farm boy watched the twin suns set and felt something pulling at him that he could not name. 19 years after Order 66, that boy found Obi-Wan. Years later, he stood in a swamp on Dagobah, lifting rocks with his mind, while the same Jedi Master who sat on the Council when the Republic collapsed corrected his form and waited for the boy to become what the galaxy needed. Yoda had spent his exile preparing for the moment the Force needed him again. The years on Dagobah had given him time to reckon with the failures of the Order he had led, from the blindness that let Palpatine rise to the rigidity that pushed Anakin away. That failure had reshaped everything he understood about the Force. Rather than simply hiding, Yoda had preserved what still mattered, studying the deeper reaches of the Force and waiting for the student who would carry it forward. After years of Imperial hunting, Inquisitors, and pressure, he was still alive and still teaching. As though nothing the Empire had built could reach him in that swamp, Order 66 destroyed the Jedi Order as a public institution. It gutted the Temple, scattered the students, and turned some survivors into pursuers. But it never destroyed the conditions that made Jedi possible. Younglings born with the Force, teachers who remembered, archives that endured, strangers who helped, and a hope that kept finding new lives to carry it forward. The Purge worked as a massacre, but failed as extinction. The struggle born from that failure was only beginning. The tradition reached back thousands of years to the very dawn of the Jedi Order itself, and the full weight of those origins reveals just how deep the roots of the Force truly go. Even the Temple guards, the silent protectors who once watched over that ancient knowledge, carried a history far darker than their armor ever suggested.